In the early days of localizing manga, the only way to read most stories was through unofficial scanlations, put together most frequently by amateur translators or those looking to make a career in a related field. These early translations of manga and anime helped forge the way to the accessibility we know today. In the West, and though in recent years this is changing, manga historically was not as popular as its fluidly visual counterpart, so even today, many older titles are still only available through unofficial means. If You Listen Closely is one such title. It is a short, one-volume work by Aoi Hiragi released between the months of July and October 1989. It is the story of Shizuku, a middle school girl searching for love and her own story. The manga spends the majority of its length on developing the relationships between its lead Shizuku and her enemies-to-dating partner Seiji, Shizuku's older sister and the older brother of Seiji, and the long-lost love between the Baron and the potential Baroness who may or may not even exist. It was translated by a man named Eugene Woodbury, who went on to translate the 1969 manga Triton of the Sea with digital manga, as well as writing his own novels in the fantasy and science fiction genres. He has a focus on historical elements with a wealth of knowledge about Japan from his time studying and living there. You can check out his website and read about his recent translation efforts and a blog with his sister where he writes about anime. Links will be below. A huge thanks to you for offering some information for this video. After working on the translation of If You Listen Closely and completing it at about the same time Whisper of the Heart's film was first released in English in the United States, he was approached by a fan scanlation site called Shōjo Magic and asked if they could host the manga. He agreed. The site was started in roughly 2001 to 2002 under a different name by a user called Cherry 18, and for some time was a subsidiary of a larger site. Its first hosted work was Boys Over Flowers. This is so significant because in the early days of scanlation, most works available were part of the shonen category. Shōjo Magic was one of the largest scanlation sites to ever exist, and they specialized in collecting everything from classic shōjo to the aged-up josei. At the turn of the century, TokyoPop was deliberately investing in shōjo series and became the biggest single distributor of shōjo manga in the early to mid-2000s outside of the Japanese market. And before this gets too off topic, YouTuber Redbard has a video about TokyoPop's history if you're interested. Despite it being the turn of the century with TokyoPop beginning its major runs, it is through some independent creators and volunteers that If You Listen Closely emerged, and this is one of the many branching paths which led to its adaptation as a film by Studio Ghibli. 1995's film version of Whisper of the Heart is a coming-of-age story about a young girl named Shizuku. She finds that a boy has been checking out the same books she has and attempts to find out who he is. By following a cat, she embarks on an adventure to write her own fantasy novel and uses the statue of a cat at an antique store as inspiration, and in the end, falls in love with the boy who had been reading those same books. Due to the nature of adaptation, I want to briefly address the differences between the manga and anime. There is a clear focus on romance in the manga that is present in the film, but is not only toned down, but some romance elements were removed entirely. For example, Seiji has an older brother that ends up dating Shizuku's older sister. The subplot of the love triangle with her friend Yuko and Sugimura is almost panel for panel in the film. In the original story, Seiji wants to be a painter, and in the anime, he wants to become a luthier. But I think the biggest difference is in the infamous Cat Baron and his lost love. In the manga, the Cat Baron was supposed to have a mate, but it hadn't been created yet. Mr. Nishi bought the Baron under the promise that he would purchase the Baroness, but when the war began, he could not return to purchase her, and after it ended, he could not find the German artisan who made the cat, even with his name engraved on the Baron's foot. In the film, Mr. Nishi wanted to purchase 2 statues of a cat couple. A woman named Louise also wanted them. He agreed to purchase the Baron and she the Baroness. They agreed to meet again and reunite the cats. But then World War II happened and he was never able to find her again. This story thread is core to Shizuku finding the drive to not only create a fantasy story of her own, but also engage with research for the non-fictional elements of her story, such as mineralogy. It's a change her family sees, her studying for something that matters to her. Up to this point, Shizuku has done her schoolwork, but just enough to get by. Her family even remarks on her poor grades and their concern for her future. This is the step she takes towards adulthood, finding who she is, a passion and a drive. And to me, one of the strongest points of the film. To quote the original translator for the manga and his take on the artistic creation in the film, another thing that sets Whisper of the Heart apart for me is its depiction of the creative process. It's rare that a movie can talk about any aspect of literature, especially writing, without falling into glib stereotypes about being an artist. In the 1990s, the current generation of pioneers of animation were getting older, and artists come in just that, generations. In 1995, at the film's release, greats in the industry were aging or already deceased. Osamu Tezuka had died in 1989, and upon the release of Whisper of the Heart in 1995, Hayao Miyazaki was 54 and Isao Takahata was 60. In Miyazaki's case, he was looking to retire from the industry. With the new century quickly on the horizon, Ghibli was looking for new talent to bring the company into the new millennium. 1993's work Ocean Waves was an attempt to allow younger staff to direct a TV movie, leading to a film that went over budget and had a middling successful release. But it was in a man named Yoshifumi Kondo they saw a potential successor. Yoshifumi Kondo was born in 1950 in Gosen, Niigata Prefecture. After graduating high school, he went straight into the animation workforce. It was common for animators of this generation to not go to college, but instead work their way up in a studio by drawing background art or in-between framing, eventually becoming supervising animators or even the director of a full movie. And that was the path of Yoshifumi Kondo. Beginning at A Production, he worked his way up working on such series as Lupin III and Little Nemo. He then joined Studio Ghibli and was a character designer as well as supervisor on Grave of the Fireflies. He also worked on Kiki's Delivery Service, Only Yesterday, Porco Rosso, and Pom Poko. He was a hard worker, and his efforts on Whisper of the Heart showed that he had a knack for capturing the Ghibli storytelling essence without seeming as if he was imitating works past, while retaining his own unique and reflective style. Miyazaki wrote on his friendship and professional relationship with Kondo. When he was young, his drawings were shining with the real admiration towards youthful freedom, just as when you climb a slope and finally see a vast blue ocean over the mountain, or like a fine clear sky. His work showed such a sense of freedom. I pride myself as someone who appreciated his talent most deeply and appropriately. While he was in his 20s and I was in my 30s, we used to talk about movies we wanted to make, sitting side by side, talking with our hands. Like with a majority of Japanese companies, the working culture at Studio Ghibli was demanding and harsh. In her book Miyazakiworld, Napier writes that Miyazaki would often scream at his employees and apologize after. In an article on Anime News Network by Lindsay Loveridge, a book was published with an interview by Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki regarding the treatment of employees working under Isao Takahata, especially the treatment of Kondo. He was said to tremble at the mention of Isao Takahata's name. While the worlds of Ghibli are vast and beautiful and have such an understanding of the complexities of people, the working culture behind the films can definitely make one pause. From such toxicity came such beauty. It can be tough to reconcile. Even more vexing and troubling was the claim that the treatment by Takahata specifically had caused potential successors to leave the studio entirely, a problem that was now trying to be corrected by having longtime employee Kondo take the lead of a film. When it comes to Studio Ghibli, it is impossible to separate the studio from one of its founders, Miyazaki. Miyazaki's films specifically focus on childhood wonder, often without active parents in the films, if they're alive. While it's disingenuous and sometimes dangerous to equate the stories creators tell with the creators themselves, it is noted that in Miyazakiworld, Napier mentions that Miyazaki had made a few comments in interviews about the role of parents holding children back, and some of the comments made about his own family may have influence in his work. Miyazaki also came from a family that saw wealth by making rudders for planes during World War II. This is further supported by the theatrical pamphlet where he writes an observation on shoujo manga as a whole. There are no unsympathetic adults or bothersome rules and regulations, and the days of frustration and twisted reactions are still far off, for the protagonist is a young girl who dreams of her own story. Which makes Whisper of the Heart have such a strong break from the standard storytelling coming from Studio Ghibli's works, and by proxy, Miyazaki's works. Whisper of the Heart has in it the self-actualization of a young girl with both her parents and older sister playing an active role in her life. This is especially noteworthy because her family is the reason she succeeds. They aren't a footnote in her story, they are a core part of it, even if some of her journey seems removed from her sister and parents. This film was made with the same Ghibli style of reflective characters and earnestness, but without seeming to be an imitation of Miyazaki's work, the first work in Ghibli's history to accomplish such a feat. The film has a feel to it that other Ghibli works don't, having the vibes of a treasured memory, and I found out in my research that it was more than the story and music that caused this. The animation lines in the film are thicker because the animation frames were smaller, as is used for television animation. This causes the animation to be less detailed, and this was done to ease the workload on Kondo's first project. While done for practicality's sake, it added to the film's nostalgic charm, giving it the feeling of a whimsical and beloved remembrance of youth. The early to mid 1980s in Japan saw economic prosperity that extended to the everyday person. Most homes had a television, and a large portion of the working force were single women. Vacations were common. This is called the bubble economy. Come the late 80s and into the 90s, the bubble burst and stocks crashed. In the sphere of anime and manga, many small studios closed as the economy reeled from the crash. There was a return to traditional stories about the ways of the samurai and martial arts, and a surge in historical dramas. This affected anime, manga, J-dramas, and movies during this period. Whisper of the Heart, released in 1995, was the first time Studio Ghibli had adapted a shoujo manga. Early Japanese teaser trailers addressed that with the burst of the bubble, now was the time for simpler stories. Clearly, it was a story audiences needed during the uncertain era of the mid-1990s. Something about its simple story and release touched many, making Whisper of the Heart the top Japanese film of 1995. But there's more to it than that, of course. In a pamphlet written by Miyazaki and released at Japanese cinemas, and in the official G-Kids release of the film, they addressed the reasons they specifically wanted to adapt their first shoujo story. It is noted that there are two official English translations for this text. One is in the G-Kids Blu-ray release, and the other is in the book Studio Ghibli: The Complete Works, which had the editorial supervision of Studio Ghibli. That said, the tone and translation between these two is drastically different. The book's narrative makes it sound as if the studio heads felt that shoujo stories were not as deserving of artistic merit, while the G-Kids version is more respectful and gentler, giving a reverence to the simplicity of this shoujo narrative from which it was adapted. For example, the G-Kids pamphlet says this regarding what kinds of stories shoujo narratives have. It is a commonplace story, a love story of the type one might find in an ordinary shoujo manga. The book translates the same line as such. The original comic is nothing more than the kind of commonplace love story you find so often in girls' manga. There is also this section just a bit later. Like most of today's shoujo manga, in this story nothing particularly dramatic or pretentious occurs, for the two main characters' feelings are the only ones that count. They confirm their love for one another, but nothing happens beyond this. Shoujo manga always end right at this point, and that's exactly why they have always been so popular. And again, we look to the book. As with other current girls' manga, the only important thing is the two characters' feelings for each other, and nothing particularly eventful happens. The two confirm their mutual love, but the story doesn't go beyond that. Girls' manga always end there, which is why people have kept reading them. This dichotomy is impossible to ignore. Both give insights into the film's creation and its writing. Though even ignoring the translation, the view of why shoujo are popular ignores both the many works that don't fit the narrow view Miyazaki showcases about shoujo in this write-up, but also ignores the financial reasons that the binary of shoujo and shonen exist in the first place, that largely being the marketability of merchandise. It was considered easier to sell toys for early anime like Astro Boy and Princess Knight if it was split into a gender binary, but that is a huge topic for another video. Another example is where the specific reason Whisper of the Heart was adapted is discussed at length by both versions. So why am I proposing we make a film out of Whisper of the Heart? It is because no matter how hard middle-aged men try to point out the naivete and fragility of such dreaming, we can never deny that the longing for an encounter with the opposite sex, so wholesomely and honestly depicted in the original story, and the pure emotion that surrounds such yearnings are central aspects of what it means to be young. It's easy to cynically declare that wholesomeness is a fragile concept only possible if protected by others, or that true love can never occur in this era without serious challenges. Even if so, it seems to me that it also ought to be possible to express, in an even stronger, overwhelmingly powerful way, how wonderful the quality of wholesomeness is. Might not Whisper of the Heart be a film that accomplishes this? The book's version. So why do I propose adapting Whisper of the Heart? Because no matter how forcefully a bunch of middle-aged men argue that it's a fragile and unrealistic dream, we can't deny the longing for such an encounter and the innocent yearning this manga so honestly and soundly portrays as a crucial truth of adolescence. It's easy to ironically point out that such soundness is just fragility under the protection of others, or that true love can't exist without impediments. In that case, why couldn't we express beauty of soundness even more powerfully, overwhelmingly even? Why couldn't Oe Haragi's Whisper of the Heart form the kernel of such an attempt? Again, the book has a more negative-sounding slant, with almost an implication that if you listen closely could be good if alterations and additions were made to its story. But both of these quotes truly get to the heart of why shoujo after all this time. There is a pure earnestness in the way in which If You Listen Closely is told. And with the events of the economic crash, rise of cynical science fiction media, and uncertain social times, pure naive earnestness was just what was needed. While there is an inclination for the cynicism of adults to find fault with a studio whose image is associated with wholesomeness, I have to look at the work that was created. There are two pieces that I believe demonstrate at the core just how much respect was given to the adaptation of the film. Firstly, despite my discussion of how this film handles the romantic stories and weaves them with an anime original narrative, there is still a distinct part of the manga story that was adapted with care. It shows that the writers understood what Oe Hiragi's work was meant to exemplify. Even in the official project proposal, Miyazaki said, "As Charlie Chaplin's films once demonstrated, simply meeting a member of the opposite sex can be an uplifting experience. Like his films, this work therefore aims to resurrect the miracle of such encounters." In the original story, Shizuku is in her own world and doesn't take an active role in her life. At the suggestion by Seiji that she should write stories like the ones she reads, it sparks her to attempt her own story about a cat baron and a girl's adventure. Just as in the movie, Shizuku sees the passion with which Seiji creates and plays the violin, and with the inner workings of an ornate clock, she begins to learn about the non-fictional world around her to create her own fictional one. Seiji learns from her writing and makes a beautiful painting, and in the film, he is inspired by her rewriting of Country Roads to pursue his own dream. It is a love story, but also a story about how two people come into one another's lives and challenge themselves to do better for themselves and accomplish the impossible. But most evident to how much respect they had for the original author and work is less subjective. Miyazaki directly requested the same author of If You Listen Closely to write another manga that he could adapt to the big screen, Baron, the Cat Returns, a side story, often thought of by fans to be a story Shizuku later wrote. It is a children's fantasy about a girl finding herself in the land of cats, and the Cat Baron helping her escape. A whimsical story meant for young children, its adaptation is proof of the regard with which the studio treated the original manga's story. The 2009 recession hit the United States hard. It had a generational ripple effect across the board, from people losing their homes and livelihoods to the youth of that era. I have spoken with some who graduated that year, including a family member. For those coming of age or entering the workplace at this time, it was bleak. It shifted the landscape of how people saw their future. Even if this film doesn't directly address it, the marketing for the film addressed Japan's own economic crisis. The economic instability from the 80s into the 90s affected many lives, especially the futures people envisioned for themselves. I think it's well said that the writer Miyazaki, speaking for who I imagine to be director Yoshifumi Kondo and producer Toshio Suzuki in the pamphlet release, acknowledged that their youths were different to the landscape of youth now, and that this was their attempt at addressing some of the mishaps they had made, while knowing their lives can't be a direct one-to-one comparison. The responses viewers have had to the film are just as interesting as the story itself. I have talked to several viewers, and while every one of them could note the beats of the story, its essence was entirely different with each telling. For some, the movie is a thoughtful and understanding look at first love, as shown by the enemies to lovers plotline between Shizuku and a boy at school. For others, it was about ambition and the rough creative talent each person possesses. A wonderfully simple scene about a geode's untapped potential is the emotional crux of the film. Others find it a story about growing up, and Shizuku establishing herself as a girl who is capable of growing up, seen in the moment where she sets a goal for herself to write a fantasy novel and works on studying nonfiction to do so. She sits with her parents and asks them to disregard her poor grades until she finishes a project, and then she'll resume her traditional studies. Her father, especially, notices a change in her behavior as she sits in the library reading history and geology books and taking notes. A very mature take on prioritizing goals and the reality of the creative process in a busy life. For a film with no antagonist, no action scenes besides snippets of the fantasy Shizuku is writing, no heavy conflict to resolve, it is still a story with so many threads that audience interpretation is just as important as the ways in which the directors decided to adapt the more simplified manga. You can even see that interpretation in what scene I spent the most time describing the examples of. I focused on her ambition and personal challenge to be a novelist rather than the romantic angle, despite that part of the story not happening until halfway into the film. It's why as a teen, I related with Shizuku's endless possibility, and how as an adult, I evaluated my own life to see if I had maintained those ambitions, even if their details had changed. I'm not the only one this happened to. In Japan, there was a rescreening of Whisper of the Heart in 2013. Fans took to forums to voice their thoughts after having seen it now that they are well into adulthood. It must be noted, I cannot find the original forum this discussion took place in, as it appears the thread was deleted or archived, so this information comes from an article about it and some of the screen grabs available. Many users were lamenting that their own lives had not turned out as they'd hoped in their youth. with several making comments about wanting to commit suicide with varying levels of comedic intent. Some said they wish they hadn't watched the movie at all. One saddening post simply stated, "Give me my youth back." While I don't know these individual users, I don't think it's a stretch to look at the working culture and expectations of youth in Japan and see why they've experienced these feelings. The story places an importance on taking active steps to achieve one's dreams. Even Shizuku's mother is a hard worker, taking steps to go back to school for further education. There's this unconscious effect I've noticed coming out of a lot of nerd content that the only time to reach your ambitions and change the world is when you're young. A majority of mainstream modern fantasy anime has teenage protagonists. And while this was a little different in the 80s and 90s due to the rise of science fiction, and more specifically cyberpunk, I've found that effect can really alter the perceptions people have of what being a successful adult means. In the movie, Shizuku and Seiji have to wrestle with the fact that if they take an unconventional path, they only have themselves to blame if it doesn't work out. I imagine many who viewed this film had the idea that they could find magic in the endless horizon, the fantasy of creating their own version of adulthood. There is a form of literary theory by Norman Holland dealing with a reader's response to media called psychological reader response theory that I feel is very topical here. In it, the evaluation of a piece of media is determined by how a viewer processes the information and not just on the information itself. The first stage is called the defense stage, where viewers are confronted by something in media that makes them uncomfortable. Mr. Nishi is someone whose life was altered permanently by war. He lost both the Baroness and the woman he fell in love with. While he has a relatively successful life, being confronted with the idea that losing love due to something outside of someone's control is uncomfortable. There could easily be this rejection of the idea that someone wouldn't be able to find love. The second stage is a fantasy of how that discomfort is avoided to digest the story on the page. Mr. Nishi may not have found love, but he has friends and family that care for him, and a successful business where he can pursue his hobby at his leisure. The final stage is called transformation, which is where someone takes their interpretation of a work and the textual reality of the work and mixes them, coming up with a reality that doesn't address their own emotional response to a work. Perhaps it's that the world is more connected now than ever, so losing a love like Mr. Nishi just won't happen anymore. Of course I can be like Seiji and make my dreams a reality. Striking out on your own is hard, and as much as many decry a standard 9-to-5 job or a lucrative career in lieu of the arts, there is a stability in it. There's magic in making a living by writing novels or carving violins, and even the film says, yes, you can do those things, but make sure you have a way to support yourself. Whatever the case, with a story about the ambition of an adolescent growing up and knowing a bit about the working culture in Japan, it's no wonder that those in Japan said they felt depressed watching it. I've heard the same from fans who watched it as adults in the United States. Reality and fantasy go hand in hand and are simultaneously at odds with one another. Perhaps Shizuku's story of the cat baron accompanying a young girl on a magical adventure is closer to home than a lot of us realize. This movie, though it doesn't have the bombastic ending of Howl's Moving Castle or detailed fights of Princess Mononoke, it's just as complex to those who both created it and the many who watched it. Even today, you can see this draw. Shizuku studying in her room was the inspiration for Lo-Fi Girl, and the several incarnations made since have been a mainstay in popular culture, which makes the following events all the more melancholic. The rising director, Yoshifumi Kondo, died of an aortic dissection just 3 years later at 47. In his death, a family and friends lost their loved one. Studio Ghibli no longer had a successor to continue the legacy, and the world lost what further art he could have created. His death is often partially blamed on the intensive working culture at Studio Ghibli, especially the treatment by Isao Takahata contributing to his declining health. The eulogy for Kondo, penned by Miyazaki, states, "He had punctured his lungs several times before, and even though the doctors had told him that he would die unless he was hospitalized, he always came back to work, managing the pain with acupuncture. I was convinced that he would surely come back this time, too." Even though his lungs were about to be punctured, Kon-chan didn't stop moving his pencil, withstanding his pain. In many ways, in our profession, we wear ourselves out, and once we get through this final wrap, we can take a brief rest and we can start working again. So I had assumed. I don't want to make it sound as if Miyazaki only focused on what work Kondo could do. This was a smaller piece of a beautiful whole on the kind of person Kondo was, his professional career, and the grief Miyazaki had at losing a dear friend. Miyazaki went on to say that he hopes one day the studio can make another piece that captures the kind of person Kondo was. What works Kondo could have made after Whisper of the Heart, especially future projects that could have been made without major input from Takahata and Miyazaki, will never be known. Time is the only true, non-renewable resource, and Whisper of the Heart embraces the smallest and most mundane moments of it to the fullest. the magic of the ordinary, and the earnestness for the ambition of creation. Even today, it stands out for its timelessness, though locked in its own snapshot of time.